Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Waco MPO public informational meeting. It's Monday, January 24. The purpose of this meeting is to talk about transportation performance management and specifically 3 annual performance targets that we are required to set each year. So first, we'll start with an introduction to the Waco MPO, then provide a background and overview of transportation performance management. Then we'll move on to the specifics of the 3 annual performance targets for which we are requesting public input and your feedback. That includes transit asset condition, transit safety targets, as well as roadway safety targets. And then we'll end the presentation with information on how you can participate in this process and provide your input. So first, what is the Waco MPO? So the Waco MPO provides local input into long-term and regional transportation decisions. The MPO helps to prioritize regionally significant projects using realistic funding strategies. The MPO helps to decide how federal highway and transit funds are to be used within the Waco region through our policy board. And the MPO also provides assistance to local governments and TxDOT in identifying these transportation priorities. And overall, the intent is to guide how future transportation networks should look and function for all users in our region. MPOs in general are required for urban areas with at least 50,000 of population. The Waco MPO is governed by a 20-member policy board that's supported by a technical committee or a technical advisory committee. And the role of the policy board, the technical committee, and MPO staff is to help with a 3C process, which includes coordination and consensus building, again, to plan and fund transportation projects. And our planning area includes all of McLennan County. So on to the content and tasks for today. So transportation performance management. Transportation performance management, or TPM, it's a strategic approach that's set by the federal government, and it uses goals, measures, and data to make better informed decisions about how to invest transportation funding. It's federally required by Congress through the FAST Act, the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. And the goal of TPM is to improve the performance of the national transportation system, focusing on delivering goods efficiently and focusing also on having safe and reliable journeys to work, school, shopping, community activities, things like that. TPM is also based on a performance-based decision process. We do that through our long-range transportation plans and short-range implementation programs. So that's our MTP, our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and TIP, Transportation Improvement Program. And those are documents that are developed by us at the Waco MPO. So those documents must demonstrate a performance-based decision process that ties back to these performance targets. And there are 5 of them: roadway safety, pavement and bridge condition, travel time reliability, public transportation asset condition, and public transportation safety. So first, we're going to talk about public transit asset condition, and I will hand it off to Annette.
Thank you, Chelsea. So in accordance with federal legislation, state transit operators and MPOs use performance measures to monitor how well the transportation system is meeting public expectations. For instance, whether the performance of the system is getting better or worse over time. Performance results can tell us whether the types of investments and strategies that we are implementing help us achieve our access and mobility goals that are set out in our long-range plan, MTP. Some of those goals are system safety, access to regional population, employment, cultural, and recreation centers, and also like the health of the regional economy. Performance results also help us identify current and future transportation needs. So the intent of the legislation is that transportation investment decisions made by local decision makers are based on data and evidence so that those investments remain realistic and achievable. So this is accomplished in part through the plans and the programs of MPOs. So the Federal Transit Administration requires 3 transit performance measures to be set annually related to the condition of transit equipment and facilities. They provide parameters for doing so with a defined useful life benchmark for transit vehicles, and that's related to the age of our buses and vans, and a term scale, a TERM scale, related to the condition of our facilities and their contents. So each year, transit providers assess the condition of their vehicles and facilities relative to the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, definition of state of good repair, that is SGR. So the SGR is the condition in which a capital asset is able to operate at a full level of performance, recognizing that as assets age, their level of performance declines. So the process of setting TAM targets or transit asset condition targets, and then assessing their progress gives transit providers a snapshot of the health of their assets on an annual basis and throughout their life cycles. And this helps local decision makers plan future investments at appropriate times. And the process also gives FTA context on the state of transit assets nationwide. So there are no penalties for transit agencies or MPOs for missing TAM targets, and no reward for attaining them, but their information collected over time may affect changes in process at the federal level and may also affect the types of projects selected by state DOTs. So we can't say yet how that might trickle down, because performance management in the metropolitan transportation planning process has only been in place for a few years. So although there are no direct consequences to missing target, it isn't meaningless. So last year, Waco MPO supported Waco Transit's TAM targets for the calendar year 2021. And in doing so, the MPO agreed to select a mix of projects that help Waco Transit achieve their asset condition targets. This is reflected in the MPO's long-range plan and the short-range plan, like Chelsea mentioned, and the 2045 MTP and our current TIP, which is fiscal year 21 through 24 TIP improvement program. Last September, the Waco City Council accepted Waco Transit's TAM targets for calendar year 2022, and that's reflected in the column 4 on this chart. I know this chart's overwhelming, but what it boils down to is that despite the addition of several new vehicles during recent years, Waco Transit's remaining fleet continues to age, with several vehicles passing the FTA useful life benchmark measure in 2022. Basically, it indicates that Waco Transit would have to replace 17 vehicles to reach its 2022 targets. That's not to say that we have to replace 17 vehicles immediately. Aging vehicles are still safe. It's just to note that to remind everyone that as they age, they're more prone to unexpected mechanical failures, which then lead to a greater risk of delay for transit passengers. So basically, this chart gives local decision makers an annual snapshot of the condition of regional transit assets so that they can plan ahead for improvements. And planning ahead for vehicle replacements is especially important right now due to chip shortages caused by COVID-19 supply chain disruptions. And the bottom of this chart shows that Waco Transit facilities continue to score well for overall condition and have a relatively low % of elements that are considered less than adequate. So we move on. So the takeaways for the discussion of 2022 TAM targets is that Waco Transit uses the TAM process as a guide for their replacement schedule. And although there was no vehicle purchased in 2021 and none planned for 2022, there will be likely new vehicles purchased in 2 or 3 years. So a route realignment study is currently underway, and the hope is that that will also guide the types of vehicles that are purchased. And that study should conclude in 2 or 3 months. So then, okay, so I'm going to move on to the public transit agency safety targets. So the FAST Act requires that each transit agency that receives federal funding is required to identify baseline safety metrics and performance targets that the agency can realistically accomplish, and that's in a plan referred to as the PTASP, or the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. The intent of FTA is to better assess safety risk within transit networks. And the objective of the PTASP is to improve safety by proactively managing internal safety risks, to better predict and reduce the frequency of safety events, and then ensure realistic safety improvements, guide funding prioritization. So Waco Transit initially adopted their safety plan in June of 2020. That plan is updated every 4 years or when revisions are required. But then the safety performance in that plan those performance targets are set annually. MPOs must demonstrate how projects identified in the MTP and the TIP are intended to assist in accomplishing those PTASP targets. So in 2021, the MPO agreed to select a mix of projects that help Waco Transit achieve their safety goals. This is reflected in the Short Range Improvement Program and will be referenced in the next Long Range Plan amendment and in the next Long Range Plan, or MTP. Much of the Waco Transit's PTASP involves internal operation practices. Let me state that again, sorry. Much of Waco Transit's PTASP involves internal operational practices that are not part of the Metropolitan Transportation Planning process, so they really aren't relevant to the MPO, but the portions that are relevant are performance targets regarding fatalities. Sorry, I cannot speak this morning very well. Portions that are relevant are targets regarding fatalities, such as serious injuries, number of safety events, and significant mechanical failures for both fixed route and demand response services. So each year, Waco Transit reviews its safety plan, and in order to assess safety performance, Waco Transit depends on data from the prior year from FTA. FTA had not released data for 2020 at the time Waco Transit's annual PTASP certification was due, so no refinement to safety targets was recommended. So last September, the Waco City Council adopted the same safety targets outlined for 2021 for 2022. But even without a full assessment, we can see that the number of of fatalities and serious injuries are low and would be difficult to improve upon. So if the plan goal is to maintain low numbers of injuries and no fatalities, this chart shows that safety goals and targets are in line. The National Transit Database, or NTD, defines a major mechanical system failure as a failure of some mechanical element of the revenue vehicle that prevents the vehicle from completing a scheduled revenue trip or starting the next scheduled revenue trip. As we saw in that previous slide, the Waco City Council adopted that same mechanical failure targets for 2022 as they did for 2021. So we don't have 2021 mechanical failure rates for a full assessment. So we're looking at 2020 rates to give you a snapshot of sorts. And that's fine because this rate in this chart will be assessed by FTA over time. So the 2020 failure rate is a bit on the high side, and it's related to the vehicles, the age of the vehicles that are being used. And this will improve over time with vehicle purchases, so it's not too concerning yet. So how does the MPO help improve the transit system? Well, as we're developing our long-range plans, we need to be considering the condition of our regional infrastructure. The condition of pavements, lane markings, traffic signals, and signage are all important to transit operations. And the condition of our transit fleet and the severity of crashes is also something we want our decisions to favorably impact. So MPO decision makers give priority to actions and projects that address these issues. So that's how that is done. And so now I'm going to give it back to Chelsea, and then at the end we're going to talk about how you can submit comments or ask us questions. Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks, Annette. Okay, so the last of the 3 annual performance targets is roadway safety. So again, this is also required by the FAST Act. The purpose is to maintain safe roadway networks. And so to make sure that safety improvements are helping to guide funding prioritization regionally and locally. So there are 5 performance measures within the roadway safety target. That includes the number of fatalities, the fatality rate, so that's the rate per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, the number of serious injuries, the serious injury rate, and then the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries in one metric. And again, we have to reassess and set these performance targets every year. So as a recap, last year for 21, the Waco MPO supported TxDOT's statewide targets. And what that means is the MPO is agreeing to select a mix of projects that helps the state achieve those statewide targets. And we do that through our MTP and our TIP. And again, the FAST Act does not require the MPOs to set their own targets, but it is an option. Each annual set of targets is independent from previous years, and it also uses a rolling 5-year average to kind of account for extreme outlier years. And one thing of note that was included in the statewide targets last year is TxDOT started using their Road to Zero Vision Program goals. And what that means is TxDOT has a goal of reducing fatalities to 0 by 2050, which is also half by 2035. So here are what the statewide targets look like for this current year, 2022. You can see it's expressed as a 5-year average on the last row of the table. The 2022 targets are highlighted in yellow. The data for 2018 to 2020 are actual numbers because these have been finalized. 2021 is still shown as a target because it's still going to be a few more months before we know the final numbers here. But what we're really interested in to help us make this decision locally is how did we do? How did McLennan County perform on roadway safety in 2021? So this table shows the 21 performance for those 5 measures that we talked about in the first slide. They're shown in red because it's preliminary. Again, like this data won't be finalized for a few more months, but it is current as of January 10, and this comes from the TxDOT Crash Information System, or CRIS. So this table compares the 21 actual performance to the baseline period of 2012 to 2016, as well as 21 safety targets. And I'll say that these 21 safety targets are provided for context and for context and for some reference point, because remember, we supported the statewide targets last year, but it is helpful to kind of extract that same logic and using our local numbers so we can compare our progress over the years. I will say that if you look toward the right, did we meet our target or did we do better than baseline? The answer is mostly no. We did marginally better than baseline for the rate of fatalities. I will say that this is not unique to Waco or McLennan County. That performance is consistent with the national trend of increased injuries and fatalities on roadways, especially during the COVID pandemic, so the years 2020 and 2021. For example, a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration behavioral safety research brief published in June of 2021 found that speed, traveling without a seatbelt, and impaired driving all remain higher in 2020 and 2021 compared to pre-pandemic times. In Texas, 2021 was the year with the second highest fatalities on record. The first highest is 1980. Fatality rate was also at a 10-year high in 2021. So these increases are happening across the board in nearly every category as it relates to roadway safety. So, more analysis is going to be needed as we dive deeper in this to get a better understanding of these trends. Here is the McLennan County historical 5-year rolling averages, because again, we want to look at the 5-year rolling averages to give us a better sense of our performance as it relates to roadway safety. The baseline period is 2012 to 2016. And again, the current period is shown on the bottom in red because the data is preliminary. But let's move on and look at these in graphic form, which should be a little easier to digest. So these are McLennan County fatalities. Again, from the baseline period to the current period, you can see that fatalities are trending up. Here's the fatality rate. So again, it is the rate per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. This graph looks a little unusual with the dip here in the 2015 to 2019, but I think it's because 2015, 2016, and 2018 had annual fatality rates that were fairly low compared to all of the other years. So I think that's what's showing the dip. And also, if you look at the range on the graph, it's actually about only 0.1. McLennan County serious injuries have been trending down for a long time, but have been trending up starting in this last 5-year average. And for 2021, we do know that the number of serious injuries is particularly high, 272, which is, off the range of this graph here. For serious injury rate, was generally trending down and flat with a little bit of a creep up right here for our current period. And again, that's probably because the 2021 serious injury rate is particularly high, which is influencing the small increase. So the serious injury rate is 8.5 for 2021, again, which is above the range for this average here. So for non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, there is a clear trend of this steadily increasing. Again, not unique to just our region. In Texas, bike and pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries increased across the board in 2021. For example, pedestrian fatalities are up 12% since 2020, serious injuries up 18%, and for bicycles, fatalities are up 10% and serious injuries up 13%, and this is statewide. So this is a problem that we will need to address together. So what does this mean looking forward? We looked at how we did for 2021. Not great news, seeing the numbers trending in the wrong direction. So what do we do? Our staff recommendation is going to be to continue supporting the statewide targets, because again, we believe this is something that we need to work on together and for a unified way. So these numbers again provide some context for the region, because remember, when we say we're going to support TxDOT targets, what we're doing is we're agreeing to plan and program projects that will contribute toward the accomplishment of those statewide goals. So in order to do that, it's helpful to illustrate what those same targets would look like using our regional numbers. So that's what these are. As you can see, continuing to support the state targets would result in just incremental changes from 21 to 22 using our regional figures. But again, these are targets, and based on the graphs we just saw, we know in realities our numbers don't look like this. So what can we do to get closer to this? So what will it take to achieve zero fatalities by 2050? Based on the data we've seen, we need to tackle this issue regionally and statewide. We need to look at more than just roadway infrastructure projects. Need to look at how policies, programs, education, et cetera, can help us move toward those targets. The Waco MPO is about to start a regional vision and strategic planning process that will help us set our values. And this will again set us up for the next long range planning cycle for the MTP. As part of that process, we will be developing project selection criteria that is specifically aimed at reducing fatalities and serious injuries for all modes. We can do that through our crash analysis, looking at crash reduction factors and proven safety countermeasures. So these are all ways that we would start the process of programming and selecting a mix of projects to help improve roadway safety. And again, this is a team approach. We would work with our partners at TxDOT, other MPOs, the Texas Transportation Institute on peer exchange, best practices, data sharing. Another thing worth mentioning that's in process is that in August of 2021, TxDOT announced a new safety task force, and this includes representatives from the Transportation Commission, TxDOT districts and divisions, as well as 7 different MPOs across the state that represent a pretty diverse set of MPO characteristics, from the large MPOs to the smaller ones. And the purpose of this task force is to help identify short-term plans for funding investments, long-term plans for funding sources, and to develop ways to measure effectiveness and describe incentives, again, all with the goal of reducing deaths on Texas roadways. So the Waco MPO will help to participate in this effort through our MPO representation on the task force, and again, help guide our efforts in a unified way to help the state achieve these roadway safety targets, performance targets. So here are the public comment opportunities. So we're accepting comments on all 3 of these annual performance targets. The comment period starts today and will be going through February 2nd. Then the next step, after we've received your comments and incorporated them, we'll be going to the Technical Advisory Committee for a recommendation. And that is going to be on February 3rd. And then public hearing and policy board action is scheduled for February 17. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I probably don't have any, but I will pause here just in case. So we're accepting questions through the end of the comment period on February 2nd. So there are a number of ways to get in touch with us that's listed here. And feel free to contact us at any time. And with that, we thank you for listening.